I rise to add my voice for the bipartisan disapproval of the President's nuclear agreement with Iran that we have been debating all week and we will continue to be debating. Now, I do so in the spirit that resulted in 83 U.S. senators from both sides of the aisle in a letter just last year to the President of the United States. This letter, which hasn't gotten a lot of attention in this debate, and I certainly think it should. In that spirit, the Senate, in an incredibly bipartisan way, by the way, several of those senators are still here. 41 Democrats, 41 Republicans, one independent, who signed this letter to the President of the United States saying, these are the strategic goals we want in this agreement. These are the goals that we should have for the United States security. These are the goals that we think will protect America and our allies. None of these, Mr. President, have been met in the nuclear agreement that we've been debating. This letter says that any agreement Iran must dismantle its nuclear weapons program and prevent it from ever having a path to a nuclear bomb. It also states that Iran should have no inherent right to enrichment. I commend my colleagues to reread this letter. The President's nuclear deal clearly does not meet the goals that are laid out in the letter. Nonetheless, it's become clear that a number of senators on the other side of the aisle are going to vote to support the President's agreement, despite having signed that letter. That's going to be a personal decision for them, but if you're a signatory, you ought to take another look at the letter you signed to the President and the American people in 2014. Mr. President, I want to lay out a few of my concerns about the deal. Many of my colleagues have done, I think, a fantastic job this week. And I don't want to name names, but there's so many on both sides of the aisle, again, bipartisan, who have raised their concerns about the President's Iranian nuclear deal. One of the biggest frustrations I think so many of us have seen as we have done our sacred duty in this body to read the agreement, to understand the details, to go to all the hearings and briefings, to reach out to experts in the field. As we have raised questions about this agreement, what we don't get is straight talk. What we've been getting, unfortunately, is spin. I think Senator Coates did a great job yesterday of explaining how this agreement is filled with ambiguities, with language that allows it to mean so many different things to so many different people, including Iranians. Let me provide a few examples that many of us have raised, that I've spoken on the floor about in the past, but I think they're important enough and they bear repeating. First, Secretary Kerry came and said to us, there's no grandfather clause in this agreement. So we see Europeans rushing now to invest in Iran. Secretary said, there's no grandfather clause. Here's what paragraph 37 of the agreement says. In such an event that sanctions are reimposed, the provisions in this paragraph would not apply with retroactive effect to contracts signed between any party in Iran or Iranian individuals and entities prior to the date of application. Well, Mr. President, that sure sounds like a grandfather clause to me, but we're told it isn't. Second, there's been much talk about this snapback provision, but there's no provision in this agreement that says snapback. We're talked about how we're going to immediately increase sanctions overnight. Mr. President, I had the opportunity to be part of the Bush administration's team that was economically isolating Iran. We went around the world to our allies. We had to threaten, in many cases, our European and other allies to divest out of Iran. That's how we got the economic isolation of Iran. This took years to do this. This took years. And yet this administration is saying overnight, despite the fact that European companies are already in Tehran investing, we're going to snap back sanctions overnight. It's not a snap. Divestiture out of Iran is a slog, and it'll take years again. The snapback is a fallacy. And finally, Mr. President, Senator Ayotte and others have done a great job of raising questions. A basic scenario that's laid out, very important, with regard to other paragraphs in this agreement. On an important hypothetical that's actually very likely. We've asked Secretary Kerry, Secretary Lew, a number of us, let's assume sanctions are lifted. 6 to 9 months, the economy starts humming, the Annex II sanctions are lifted. Iran still is a sponsor of terrorism, the world's largest sponsor of terrorism, and they commit an act of terrorism. This body goes to reimpose sanctions. Whoever the next president is agrees because of some heinous act of terrorism. What Iran can do is cite either paragraph 26 or paragraph 37 that states, if sanctions are reinstated in whole or in part, Iran will treat that as grounds to cease performing its commitments under the entire agreement. So what happens? We re-sanction Iran for a terrorist action that they're likely to take. They say, hey, we can legally walk. Read paragraph 26, read paragraph 37, read our letter to the UN Security Council. It's all laid out there. They walk legally. Sanctions are lifted. They're still the #1 sponsor of terrorism in the world. Their economy's humming, and they're on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon. We have asked that question to the administration leaders who negotiated this deal time and time again, and they have never given us an answer of why that's not a correct reading of this agreement. Because it is. Mr. President, these are just a few examples. Many of my colleagues have done an outstanding job of looking at different parts of this agreement, expressing our concerns. But just as important is, what do our constituents think? What do Alaskans think? What do the American people think? You know, like all of my colleagues, I spent my recess back home in Alaska. And I talked to hundreds of my fellow Alaskans at town hall meetings, roundtable discussions, our state fair. Remarkably, I did not have one Alaskan come up to me saying, I really think you should support that Iranian nuclear deal of the president's. Every single interaction I had was in opposition to this agreement. And it was visceral, particularly among Alaska veterans. Now, we're a proud state. We have the largest number of veterans per capita of any state in the Union. But whether they were recent vets from Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam vets, they literally would look at me and say, what on earth are we doing? Help me understand that, Senator Sullivan. What are we doing? Visceral. And during this debate this week, even some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they're not big supporters. They're using terms like seriously flawed, deeply flawed, serious concerns, falls short in many areas. Across the country, Americans are overwhelmingly opposed to this deal by a margin of 2 to 1. And the more the public knows about the deal, the more they dislike it. These poll numbers in terms of support are dropping. Right now, latest poll, 21% of Americans, that's it, support this deal. Mr. President, the people are wise. They elected us to listen, and we should do so. They might not know all the details like some of us do, but they know, I saw it from my constituents, that something is fundamentally wrong with this agreement. So we have to ask ourselves, why? Why? Why are Americans, the more the president and John Kerry talk about this agreement, the more Americans become opposed to it? And why are even the supporters, as we saw this week, so tepid in their support? Now, all negotiations require compromise. All negotiations require concessions. We all know this. We've negotiated. And in fact, many of my colleagues, particularly on the other side, emphasize this. Hey, concessions are part of what we do. They're part of an agreement. But Mr. President, at a certain point, concessions become humiliations. If they are too significant and too frequent, concessions are humiliations. No one likes to be humiliated. But especially proud citizens of a great nation like the United States do not like to be humiliated. And that's what I believe is going on here. This, I believe, explains the visceral reaction that we have seen in opposition to this deal. Americans feel that our concessions, not just to any country, but to the world's #1 sponsor of terrorism, have gone so far that they're humiliating to our great country. People feel that our concessions have gone so far, it's as if we're treating Iran as an equal. And Iran is not an equal to the United States of America. I first started to realize this and sense it during our briefing, closed briefing with Undersecretary Wendy Sherman, Undersecretary of State Sherman. She was sent to brief the Senate on the secret side deal between the IAEA and Iran involving the inspection regime at the Parchin military facility, long suspected as Iran's premier nuclear weapons facility. Senator McCain talked about this briefing yesterday, and for those of us, again, Democrats or Republicans, who went to this briefing, it was pretty remarkable, and I'm not saying that in a positive way. It was actually unbelievable to have a senior member of the Obama team, negotiating team, first begin the briefing by telling us she had seen this secret side deal, but she didn't have a copy of it. And she wasn't allowed to have a copy of it because it was just between Iran and the IAEA. So the Iranians had it, they were reading it, but not us. No matter that the president had just signed a law, the Corker-Cardin law, that required the administration to provide this agreement to the Congress, no matter that the United States is a board member of the IAEA, not only a board member, we are the country that came up with the idea of the IAEA. This was an American initiative in the 1950s. Our board member could have demanded this agreement. But we were told it was just between Iran and the IAEA. This, of course, was an affront to the law, to the American people, but the worst was yet to come. Undersecretary Sherman then actually described the substance of this secret side deal, the essence of which we all know now because it was eventually leaked to the press. Here's the essence of that side deal. Iran will conduct the inspections at the Parchin nuclear facility by themselves, with no one else present. Let me repeat that. No one else is allowed on that facility. Iran will conduct the inspections by itself. They will take air samples. They will take environmental samples. She was literally describing Iranian officials with a camera filming themselves in the facility with no one else there. And they were going to give this film and these samples, whose chain of custody we can't trust, to IAEA officials who are not allowed on the facility. Every jaw in that room dropped. Every senator, Democrat, Republican. I remember looking around the room. We couldn't believe it. The heads were shaking. The U.S. Senate was stunned. After claims by the president that his agreement had the most intrusive inspection regime ever, after being told by the president that his agreement had nothing to do about having to trust Iran, it wasn't about trusting Iran, we're told in a briefing by one of his top negotiators that with regard to the most suspicious nuclear weapons facility site in Iran, the Iranians will inspect themselves. The AP broke the story, and when they did, they stated that the secret side deal at Parchin will, quote, let the Iranians themselves look for signs of the very activity they deny. Past work on nuclear weapons. Let me repeat that. This is the AP. Let the side deal that we're agreeing to, by the way, in the Senate, or that some of my colleagues are, will let the Iranians themselves look for signs of the very activity they deny. Past work on nuclear weapons. This secret side deal is absurd on its face. This secret side deal will let Iran cheat with impunity. This secret side deal is fully and unequivocally based on trusting the Iranians, regardless of what administration officials say about the deal. And this secret side deal is not just some kind of concession, it is a humiliation. The IAEA has never done this with any country, ever, especially a country that's a serial cheater and continues to be the world's #1 sponsor of international terrorism. For these reasons alone, as Senator Perdue mentioned yesterday, the Senate should reject the president's deal. It certainly doesn't square with many of the demands in the March 2014 Senate letter from 83 U.S. senators last year, one of which was, we believe Iran must fully resolve concerns addressed in the United Nations Security Council resolutions, including any military dimensions of its nuclear program. Well, that's not going to happen in Parchin. We believe Iran must also submit to a long-term and intrusive inspection and verification regime. 83 senators said this to the president. That's not going to happen at Parchin either. But, Mr. President, these kind of absurd concessions go much further than the Parchin inspection side deal, and they are the driving force why so many Americans reject this deal so overwhelmingly. When we agreed to lift sanctions on General Sullivan, the head of the Quds Force, that wasn't a concession. That was a humiliation. And as Senator Ernst said last night, it was a slap in the face of our veterans, many of whom were killed by IEDs supplied by General Sullivan. When the leader of Russia, one of our so-called international partners, met with General Sullivan recently to discuss arms transfers, that wasn't a concession, that was an outrage. When the United States, in the president's agreement, states that it wants a, quote, new relationship with Iran, and they don't respond in kind in the agreement, but respond by saying death to America in their weekly chants, that's not a concession. That's a humiliation. When we agree in the agreement to, quote, protect Iran from nuclear security threats, including sabotage, unquote, that's in the agreement. That's not a concession. That's an outrage. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says that under no circumstances Iran should ever obtain ballistic missiles, and only days later the Secretary of State agrees to lifting the ban on ballistic missiles and conventional weapons, that's not a concession, that's an abdication. When we go into minute detail in this agreement, dozens of pages on our obligations to lift sanctions, including our obligations to literally import Iranian pistachios, that kind of detail. And yet we can't get 4 American hostages released. That's not a concession. That's a humiliation. And finally, when we give the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism upfront relief and tens of billions of dollars in a signing bonus, and we are told by administration officials that certainly Iran is going to use some of those proceeds to conduct terrorism activities against Americans and our allies, that's not a concession, that is a surrender. Mr. President, it's the culmination of the so-called concessions that give our constituents the sinking feeling that the President's agreement is decidedly not in our interest, that it's dangerous for our country. And it's the scope and number of these concessions that solidify the sense that during these negotiations we've slowly and subtly ceded our power to a country that just recently was considered the world's #1 pariah state. When these negotiations began, every country in the world was standing against Iran. And international sanctions were crippling them. That's what brought them to the table, as Senator Corker mentioned earlier today. And guess what? This was due not to the international community's leadership, not to China, not to Russia, not the European Union. This was due to the leadership of the United States of America, to members in the Democratic Party, Republican Party of the Congress, and members of the Bush administration and the Obama administration. That's what brought them to the table. American leadership, Congress, and the executive branch working together. Remarkably, the deal the President and the administration have negotiated have flipped all of this on its head. It's incredible that we're at this point, as if we're treating Iran as an equal, blessed by all the world's great powers. And make no mistake, we are. As Senator Cardin mentioned, and others, this deal legitimizes Iran's nuclear program, and it blesses Iran as a threshold nuclear power. So the question has to be asked, why not stick to the original goals set out by the Senate just a year ago, in 2014, in the letter to the President, to dismantle Iran's nuclear capability, to prevent them from having enrichment capability? Well, according to the President, he stated, quote, "There is no one who thinks that Iran would or could ever accept that. And the international community does not take that view, that Iran can't have a peaceful nuclear program." Well, the Congress of the United States, the Senate of the United States thought that just a year ago. So it's remarkable that the President says now, there's no way we can get that done. Why not go back to Iran in the P5+1 and get a better deal? One without the serious flaws that so many members, Democrat and Republican, have stated over the last week. Well, in a remarkable interview with the Atlantic Monthly, Secretary Kerry talks about how if we sought a better deal, if he went back and sought a better deal, a deal, by the way, that 83 senators said we needed to have, we would be, quote, screwing Iran and the Ayatollah, and we will be confirming the Ayatollah's suspicion that the United States is untrustworthy. That is a quote from the Secretary of State of the United States. In another interview, Secretary Kerry said he would, quote, be embarrassed to go out and try for a better deal. Mr. President, what is most remarkable of all is that in its attempts to sell this deal to the Congress and the American people, the President and his team no longer emphasize that Iran, the world's biggest sponsor of terrorism, is isolated, is a pariah state. But instead, they emphasize that our most important ally in the Middle East, Israel, is. And so too is the Congress, and so too will be the United States if we don't approve the president's deal. On August 5th, the president stated, quote, "Every nation in the world that has commented publicly supports this agreement, except Israel." And UN Ambassador Samantha Powers, our ambassador, recently stated, "If we walk away, there's no rewrite of the deal on the table. We would go from a situation in which Iran is isolated to one in which the United States is isolated," unquote. Mr. President, this rhetoric represents a fundamental shift in a worldview. We've been debating this Iranian deal for the past week, but we really are debating America's role in the world. And there's a worldview that's taking hold with this administration. One where America is no longer the leader of the free world, but a player as part of an international partner. One where we don't lead by example, but are being led by others. One where we're leading from behind. One where we are embarrassed. Embarrassed. That's the Secretary of State's words, rather than steadfast. And one where we're more worried about, quote, screwing the head of a pariah state than standing with our most steadfast ally in the region, the nation of Israel. This kind of deal that we're debating today is what an echo chamber produces. This is what happens when you want a deal too badly. When you won't walk away from the table during negotiations. When your view of America's leadership role in the world is tentative, tepid, and not confident. And this is what happens when you fail to listen to the American people. This is what happens. Right turns wrong, good turns bad. A country that recently was a pariah state, the largest state sponsor of terrorism, is steering the negotiations. And welcome to the community of nations. And top officials in the United States of America are afraid that we will become isolated if we demand a stronger deal that keeps us and our allies safe. This, in effect, is how bad and dangerous policy is made. Mr. President, I'd like to conclude by talking about our role with regard to this agreement. History has shown that on most major foreign policy issues, when the United States of America is most effective and most strong, it's when the United States Congress and the executive are working together. That's the way our Constitution was structured, and that has been America's history since the founding of the Republic. The examples abound from this chamber. The Louisiana Purchase, something important to you, Mr. President, passed the Senate. Bipartisan majority vote, 24-7. NATO was ratified by bipartisan majority, 82-13. The first strategic arms limitations negotiation with the Soviet Union, bipartisan majority, 88-2. Even something as controversial as relinquishing control of the Panama Canal to Panama, bipartisan majority, 68-32. And more recently, in 2010, this body voted to further reduce nuclear arms with the Russians, bipartisan majority, 71-26. One common area of agreement is that everybody who's talked about this agreement this week on both sides of the aisle has stated that is one of the most important national security issues facing the United States in a generation. Whether and how and to what degree the world's largest sponsor of terrorism is going to obtain a nuclear weapon. But perhaps for the first time in U.S. history, an agreement that is so grave and important to the national security of our great nation is going to move forward, not with a bipartisan majority in the U.S. Senate, but a partisan minority in both houses. Such a result will undermine America's strength, and I believe shows a profound disregard for our constitutional form of government. Even the Iranian parliament is going to need a majority to pass this agreement. But the world's greatest democracy won't. And, Mr. President, I believe that's another humiliation. And finally, just a few hours ago, we saw what has been a theme throughout this entire process: how the administration has been dismissive of the American people, not wanting a role for the American people through their representatives in Congress to weigh in on this deal. If the president is so proud of this agreement, he shouldn't be directing Democrats to filibuster it. I believe the vote that we just took is a sad day for the U.S. Senate. If this deal was good for the country and for our allies, I would certainly be gladly supporting it. But it's not. And a bipartisan majority of the United States Senate knows it. That's why a bipartisan majority of this body is voting against it. We're doing so because it's a bad deal, a deal that will make the world more dangerous, and we're doing so because the American people see that too, and they are counting on us to protect them. Mr. President, I yield the floor.